4 long days and nights have passed since Hurricane Katrina pounded, flattened, and drowned New Orleans and much of the southeastern Gulf Coast. The death toll keeps rising, and today one Louisiana senator said 10,000 people may be dead in his state. Damage estimates for the entire hurricane zone have climbed as high as $100 billion. Today, a full 4 days after the storm hit, more federal aid finally started arriving in the area. The National Guard transported food and water, driving through streets in New Orleans that looked more like rivers. The Guard, or the cavalry as one general called them, also brought their guns and are under orders to take back the violent streets of the city. President Bush, criticized for doing too little, too late, tried to comfort some residents in Mississippi and promised to restore law and order in New Orleans. The president said he was happy with the federal response to the disaster, but he did concede he is not satisfied with the results. The president spoke after the mayor of New Orleans said the federal government does not have a clue what is going on in his city. And as gasoline prices spike all over the country, Mr. Bush warned there may be gasoline supply problems this Labor Day weekend. All week long, a team of veteran CBS News correspondents has been covering the deadly destruction and extraordinary misery caused by Hurricane Katrina. We asked newsmen John Roberts and Lee Cowan to take a step back from their daily reporting in the epicenter of the storm and share their impressions of what they've seen and felt. First, John Roberts.
I've been to a lot of these hurricanes, including Hugo in 1989 and Andrew in 1992, which were both considered to be some of the biggest storms to hit the United States with some of the most grievous damage. But I have to be honest to say that I have never seen anything like this. That the scope of the human suffering here in New Orleans is difficult to comprehend, let alone try to convey to viewers through video and through storytelling. There are so many people here who have nothing, have nowhere to go, and are not being helped. We talked with people who were on the interstate highway for 2 days in the broiling sun. No one had even come by to check on them. Certainly nobody had dropped off water. There was some water that was being dropped off as of Thursday, but certainly not enough to take care of everybody here. And the scene at the convention center in downtown New Orleans was reminiscent of something that we have seen before in perhaps places like Haiti. Thousands of people just standing around, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do.
3-week-old baby out here. They don't have no formula, no water, and they want us to survive out here. Where's FEMA? Where's the mayor?
Please, somebody.
We need some help out here.
Hurricane Andrew was said to have had a sluggish federal response, but they still got lots of water in. They got those water buffaloes that the National Guard brings in. They were distributing meals ready to eat and other relief supplies. It appears as though what happened was that the authorities locally put all of their chips into one basket, that basket being the Superdome, and just about everything else fell through the cracks. There are so many compelling stories here, and one of the most that is one of those ones that just sits with you and gives you nightmares at night and makes it difficult for you to sleep, was the story of a woman who was about 75 years old. She had been trapped in her house in the eastern section of New Orleans with water up to her chest. She was finally rescued by a boat. They brought her to the interstate along with her husband of 53 years, and then they were left on the interstate. Cars, police cars, and other emergency vehicles were traveling up and down the interstate all night long. She was desperately trying to flag them down because her husband was having a seizure. They kept passing her by, and her husband died at her feet. That was on Tuesday evening. Yesterday, we went by the same area, and that body is still sitting there. Everywhere you look here in New Orleans, there is human tragedy. We hear about violence, we hear about looting. That is just, it's an absolute minority of people. People here are angry. Some people would say that they have a right to be angry because they have literally been abandoned to fend for themselves.
John, what is the single biggest problem right now?
The single biggest problem is what to do with people who aren't at the Superdome. They're bringing in buses and they're trying to get them to facilities in Houston. They took a lot of them to the Astrodome. Governor Rick Perry is accepting up to 50,000 more. But there are thousands, tens of thousands of other people in this area who just have no place to go. We were shooting on the streets down in the eastern section of New Orleans on Thursday, and people were just walking. We saw a man who was a Vietnam veteran who gave his service to the country. He was wounded, he was disabled, unable to walk. He was being pushed along on one of those carts that you would pile boxes on, having no idea where to go. But he had to leave his neighborhood because there were no relief supplies coming into it. There was nobody who was giving them any direction. Gangs of looters were roaming through the streets. He felt it was unsafe to stay there, but they didn't have any kind of direction other than to say that they eventually wanted to get to Texas. And you see those stories repeated everywhere across this city, that the sense of desperation among these people is growing. And while the operations at the Superdome seemed by the end of the week to finally be getting into gear, there were just so many other people across the city of New Orleans and all of these other parishes who just have no help whatsoever.
Thanks, John. Lee Cowan has also been in New Orleans since the beginning. Lee?
Well, Dan, I think the comparisons probably are inevitable to last year's tsunami, but I think the difference that time around was that it seemed as if the world came to a stop and all the attention was focused on helping the people of the tsunami, and the people there got that sense and really appreciated that. I don't get that sense here at all. In fact, it is just the opposite. Almost everybody that we've talked to feels like the world's forgotten them. When we first got here, we went out to one of these freeway overpasses that essentially was the high ground, or the highest ground for people to get to. And the very first thing that happened, we were mobbed by people asking, where's the water, where's the food? A woman grabbed us, took us over to the side of a bridge and told us to look over the edge. We did, and there was obviously someone who had jumped to his death down there. And she said he'd been sitting there for 2 days saying, they're not going to bring the water, they're not going to bring the food, we're not going to make it. And one day he simply got up and jumped. A day later, we're out in a boat trying to check out the hospital situation in downtown New Orleans, and we found a patient, an actual patient still in his hospital gown, floating on a piece of plywood. He'd been there for a day and nobody picked him up. We had to pick him up. We pulled him into the boat ourselves and took him back to the hospital that we think that he came from. And there's just a sense of hopelessness here, Dan, that I don't think I've ever experienced, certainly on any story that I've been to, including the tsunami.
Lee, what about the children?
That's one of the toughest things, I think, Dan. I mean, you see 2, 3, 4-year-olds that are trying to help their parents get through this. Amazing scenes. And then you see literally newborns. I mean, children that are 10 days old, 2 weeks old. Mothers don't have any milk. They're doing the best they can to shade them from the sun. They don't have tents. They don't even have wood. They don't even have cardboard. I mean, they're literally sitting on the curbs with no water and very little food, just waiting for someone to come and pick them up.
Lee, you mentioned the sense of being forgotten, of the victims of the storm feeling that they are the forgotten people. Is or is not that sense of being forgotten justified by the facts on the ground? There are a lot of good folks here. Don't take this the wrong way. There are a lot of people who are really trying their level best to help the people that are here, but the response so far just does not seem to match the scope of the disaster. And one incident, I think, maybe sums it up the best. When all the looting started, the police tried to do their best to stop it. They got out of hand. They didn't stop it. But at one point we found ourselves in front of a door that had been broken in at a Walgreens drugstore, crowd gathering around. There was one policeman there at the door, and he said, look, I can't tell you not to go in here, but you got to do what you got to do to survive. Pretty remarkable statement. Lee Cowan in New Orleans. Thanks. Thousands of people are feared dead and still missing in New Orleans, and there's mounting concern about the threat of widespread disease. To gauge that threat, we spoke earlier with the head of the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals, Dr. Frederick Cerise. Given the situation, there's a real and present danger of epidemics such as a cholera epidemic. Are those fears justified or not?
The more immediate medical concerns at this point are those people that have special needs, that have medical conditions now. The cholera and those types of things. Probably the rescue workers that have been in the water are most at risk for that type of thing. As I said, the people that are being sheltered now, there's lots of water that's being distributed, and so that's always a concern. But we do have other more immediate concerns right now.
You have a lot of corpses floating and otherwise in New Orleans. We're still in the heat of the last days of summer. Doesn't this present an overwhelming difficulty for you, or does it?
We have a morgue effort that is ongoing now that will be collecting bodies and trying to deal with that situation. Obviously, the emphasis up to this point has been collecting live people and trying to get them to points of safety.
Doctor, were you born and raised in Louisiana?
Yes, sir.
I want to ask you a personal question. You've trained yourself as a physician. Tell me how this feels to you. What goes on inside you as you try to cope with the immensity of this catastrophe?
This is something that's not part of your training, and you can't anticipate having to deal with anything like this. And so much of what we're dealing with is not the science of medicine. It is how to get people out of disaster situations to safe environments. You know, when we were on a military vehicle that ended up being able to get through the water to Charity Hospital in New Orleans, and to see those residents in training that were in the hospital and those staff physicians there who were taking care of these people like they were their own family. They were going down 12 floors of the hospital with a patient above the head on a flat board to get them down to a boat, in this particular instance, to get them to a helipad. You know, these the residents and the physicians at the place, the care that they show and the heroism that you're seeing is just enormous.
What will it take? How long will it take for New Orleans to recover? Can it recover? That's what we wanted to find out from a disaster response expert who has worked on reconstruction after every hurricane since Hugo and in worldwide disaster zones from Somalia to Kosovo. Bob Isaacson has been in and out of New Orleans all week long. We spoke to him at his company headquarters in Mobile, Alabama. Anarchy. Too strong a word for what's happening in New Orleans and some of the surrounding area now, or an apt word?
Some of my men talked with a New Orleans police officer yesterday who said he was not going back in. They had to abandon the convention center yesterday because there's 30,000 people there that are uncontrollable, and they're in entire desperation. I mean, it's not without cause. These people are desperate. They're without hope. They have no food, no water, no job, no home, no information, and no future. It's an overwhelming situation, and it just needs a consistent help. It needs the military. They're bringing in the National Guard now. FEMA's bringing in additional people, and they need to evacuate that city as fast as they can evacuate it.
Mr. Hudson, you keep saying that you have to get the people out. Move them to where?
That's the $64 question. Look, this is a sufficient national catastrophe. If they have to close every school in the South for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and put these people in the gymnasiums of the schools in the South, throughout the South, so you disperse them, that's what they have to do. And then you take them and try to find them permanent housing. Look, this is not a short-term thing. These poor people are not going to be able to go back to New Orleans for housing for 2, 3, 4 years. If New Orleans is repaired, the houses won't be repaired. Half the houses, a third of the houses are going to be gone, to me. So this is a long-term evacuation.
Let's talk about the levees. You'd agree or not that there are few things more important than fixing the levees. What's the short and long-term outlook on that?
The short-term outlook is that the water's now equalized itself. So the levees are no longer the serious problem of trying to stabilize the pressure. You can go in and dig the base of the levees out and repair the levees, and then you can begin to pump the water out. With the pumps that they're talking about bringing in, you're talking about 2 to 3 months. They're saying they can do it in a month, and God bless them if they can.
Repair the levees, pump the water out that's in the city, and then what happens?
But not only do they have to pump the water out, they have to make a decision. This is some of the most polluted water you've ever imagined. It has everything. I mean, inside the city limits of New Orleans and Jefferson Parish, you have manufacturing plants, you have plating companies, you have companies with all kinds of hazards, you got service stations. The pollution could be overwhelming. All the sewage for all these people, all the dead animals, all the dead bodies, all of that is pollution. So they have to decide, are they going to ignore the pollution and just pump it out, or are they going to deal with the pollution first? If they begin to deal with the pollution first and have to clean the water before they put it out to the lake and the river, then you could be talking a much more long time.
For hundreds of miles east of New Orleans, communities, homes, and lives all along the Gulf Coast have been shattered and destroyed. 90,000 square miles of the coastline have been declared a federal disaster zone. Correspondent Harry Smith has been in the zone all week long.
Well, it's been an incredible journey. We got into Gulfport, Mississippi Monday night. I mean, it was a scene of just utter, total destruction. What we kept hearing day after day after day this week is all storms were measured against Hurricane Camille. Camille came through, was a killer hurricane in 1969. A couple of old timers came up to me one day this week and they said, you know what? Camille was a thunderstorm compared to what this thing was. And for the first time in my 20 years of covering these kinds of storms, it wasn't the high winds, it was just this unbelievable volume of water. Maybe the best example was the First Baptist Church in Gulfport. The church was built in 1968. Camille came in 1969. That church withstood Camille. All that's left of that church right now is a shell. You could just see where this enormous wall of water, first they were saying maybe it was 20 or 22 feet. Now they're saying maybe it was 30 or even more, literally washed ashore and wiped the walls right off the church itself.
My dog was in my apartment.
We've covered so many of these storms over the years, and there's always the anguish. There's always the heartbreak. There's always the tears. There's always this tense, this sense of being that their heart is being torn out. I don't think we even have a tiny clue as to what the death toll ultimately will be here. The pictures you see do in fact tell the story, but the people in the ground here, as resilient, as tough as they are, it's taking a terrible, terrible toll. We met a family. Their home was wiped out. Their car was covered in the flood. They couldn't drive anywhere. They had $50 in their pocket. They had all of their possessions in 2 shopping carts.
We got a little food and a little clothes, but we didn't feel safe enough to, hold on to all this with everybody there fighting.
They went to a shelter in one of these towns here in Mississippi, and they said it was just too dangerous to stay in. And they came to us as they're walking down the street, and they said, where do we go? Where do we go?
You see any difference from what you're seeing there, what you've seen on the Mississippi coast and in New Orleans? Any difference between what we saw with the tsunami?
You know, Dan, they were so quick, and especially like where I was in Sri Lanka, they set up tent cities. It was certainly more desperate in Aceh and some other places. But I kept thinking to myself all week this week, where's the relief? Where's the dramatic pulling together of these resources that we're so used to in America? And as these pictures unfolded, I kept thinking to myself, how can this be happening here? We're so used to looking at those pictures and saying to ourselves in a somewhat smug manner, well, that's what happens in a third world or a developing country. They just don't have what we have, and don't we feel sorry for them? How did this happen here like this? Lord knows, Dan, you and I have covered so many storms together. You always talked about, boy, if it hits New Orleans, boy, if it hits New Orleans. They've planned so much for it. They've talked so much about it. The worst case scenario happened, and they were not able to respond to it.